Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican politics podcast. I'm your co-host, José Luis Granados Ceja, Mexican-born journalist living and working here in Mexico City. I'm a staff writer at Venezuela Analysis, as well as co-host of their podcast as well. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Welcome to the show.
Hey, José Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin magazine in the United States, Sentido Común here in Mexico. Ready for another edition of, a couple of pauses in there just to dial up the drama, Soberanía.
You can always tell that playwright in you comes out, that thespian in you comes out.
Yeah, just kind of, cheesy, playing it up for points, right?
Hey, our viewers like it. We have fun here. Always people talk about how'd you get going? Actually, it's like Kurt was like, hey, let's do this podcast. And then we had a rapport really, really quick, which I think is really half the magic.
Yeah,
and then hopefully people like our analysis. Judging by the comments, they like what we have to say. So on this week's program, we're going to be talking about the big news out of Mexico this week, which is obviously the capture of El Mayo Zambada, which is going to have a lot of repercussions. Obviously, the Mexican connection being the fact that he was one of the major leaders of the cartel that was responsible for much of the narco trafficking. Mostly, I think he was played a much bigger role in the previous century, but obviously, he was renowned for never stepping foot inside of a jail. And well, now he is. And it's a little bit unclear exactly what's going on. Kurt will fill us in with thought on that, but I thought I'd give you the rest of the rundown. We're also going to talk about our favorite representative of the ruling class, which is Ricardo Salinas Pliego and his anti-democratic action. The guy goes around thinking that he is, God's gift to democratic societies, promising all kinds of favors and benefits for the public, but ultimately the guy has ruling class interests, and I think those have been very clearly expressed with his most recent action going after some journalists. We're going to talk about Venezuela. We're going to talk about the results there, the Mexico connection. There's a couple of ones there. We got a reaction from López Obrador, but we had some interference with some of the right-wing actors, and I think there's some parallels there in terms of how things are playing out, this whole thing around the exit polls and the polling and then the international reaction. So it's kind of a script that they seem to follow when it comes to progressive leftist governments in Latin America. And then finally, we'll be talking about the losers and haters. We got a great one this week, an incredible column that just puts it all out today. I won't say too much. We'll get to it. We're going to spend a little bit more extra time like last time. I hope you liked that last time. It is the favorite segment of many of our viewers and listeners. So I think it's good to spend some time on that. Sometimes we leave it at the end there. So we're going to get into that. But first, we're going to talk about El Mayo Zambada, who was detained by U.S. forces in some kind of caper. It's not exactly clear what's going on here. So just to fill you in, so basically there was this surprise announcement that El Mayo Zambada, together with one of El Chapo's sons, Junior, was detained in Texas after landing there in a private jet. Now, we've had a couple of days to hear more information in terms of what exactly happened there, but it's still not obvious to me. We have El Mayo Zambada's lawyer saying he was duped, that he was tricked, because there was some speculation that he had actually negotiated his detention by U.S. authorities, that he'd been in negotiations for a long time. So his own lawyer said, no, that's not true. He has pled not guilty to the charges that are being brought against him. Obviously, the usual charges you see when we see this, which is, drug trafficking and corruption, all this kind of stuff, sobornos, et cetera, et cetera. And apparently, there's now speculation that possibly Junior, El Chapo's son, who runs a faction of the Sinaloa cartel, was the one who somehow tricked him. Although that's hard to believe because, again, this guy was famous for avoiding detection and was surrounded by guards. I read a story about there that he tied up his legs and he threw them on the plane. That seems very, very hard to believe because this guy was always surrounded by guards. How would, even if it's somebody he trusts, like Guzman, that he would be able to put himself in that position? So it's not exactly clear what happened, but obviously a lot of repercussions. Did I miss anything there, Kurt? Help me out.
No, that's very complete. So, as you say, Jose Luis, there's a lot around this that seems strange and pretty hard to believe.
Yeah.
Right? Like taken right out of, a Netflix series or, a telenovela or something, right? This idea that Mayo Zambada who's a seasoned narco, could be so easily tricked to get onto a plane is hard to believe.
Yeah.
The idea that Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of El Chapo's sons, would throw him under the bus because he's upset, supposedly, that Mayo Zambada participated in one way or another in his father's being arrested, or didn't do enough to stop it, also sounds like a kind of a soap opera-ish explanation. Not impossible, but a soap opera-ish kind of thing, right? This idea that they would just fly out of Hermosillo, just like that, and just kind of pop down, outside of El Paso where they were conveniently arrested, also sounds, hard to believe, right? But as you say, what are the repercussions of this? Because we don't, clearly know everything. We're recording this on Monday, the 29th. So we're basing ourselves, on the latest information that we heard at this morning's Mañanera by Rosa Isela Rodriguez, the Secretaría de Seguridad Pública, who basically has had a cautious line of saying, this is what supposedly happened. We asked for information. We demanded information. This is what they told us. We're going to tell you what they told us, and we're not going to comment on it further.
Yeah.
Right. This is what they're being very tight-lipped about all of this. And one understands it because it's a very delicate issue. What's the name of this podcast?
Soberanía.
Sovereignty. Right. So when you have a situation in which the United States was very likely involved in one way or another in an operation on Mexican soil, it becomes a very delicate sovereignty issue, especially because of the line. The very clear line that López Obrador has been, really working to make over his 6 years in government, to insist on greater sovereignty for Mexico in food, in energy, and in security issues. The top three: food, energy, and security. And that has meant going up against the DEA. That has meant the national security law, limiting the actions of DEA on U.S. soil, right? Although even though that has not been, fully effective, right? As we saw Ann Milgram come out a few months ago and talk about their year-and-a-half operation against the sons of El Chapo, right? Los Chapitos on Mexican soil without notifying the Mexican government, right? And, the angry reaction by AMLO against that in the Mañanera. Now, here we have a situation where both sides appear to be trying to make at least the public relations effort to say that there was no violation of sovereignty. Which is interesting, actually, because when Ann Milgram came out and said, we did this, she just said, we did this, right? And the reaction against by AMLO was, at least rhetorically, quite firm.
Yes.
Right? Although, they didn't take the next extra step of kicking out DE agents and such as they could have, and I believe should have, right? Mm-hmm. Now, in this operation, it's been much more managed. It was a surprise announcement, yes. Mexico appeared to be wrong-footed when it happened. It wasn't their best mañanera. It wasn't their best day, to be honest. And then since then, there seems to have been an effort on both sides to not embarrass Mexico further and to try to establish the case that there wasn't a violation. It was not a violation of sovereignty because the plane took off from Sonora and landed in El Paso, and that is when United States agents intervened. It was just the pilot and Joaquin Guzman. Some way or another, Mayo Zambada got on that plane. Again, it seems difficult, but this is where we are at this moment, right? Yeah. Now, here's, I think, a very important point to make, right? The United States, of course, is going to spin this as a major victory. It's campaign season. They just did the switcheroo between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. The Trump campaign has been, withering in its criticism of what it says is, open borders and all this nonsense and blather, and that Joe Biden has been soft on the border. And even Kamala Harris a few years ago was given, the football of dealing with the migration issue and totally bobbled it. Remember her famous non-interview with Lester Holt on NBC where she couldn't come up with any kind of rationale whatsoever, and they kind of put her back in her office for a year and hid her. Right. Yeah. So this is something they need. This is perceived to be a weak flank of the Democrats in general, the Harris campaign specifically. So they need this. So of course they're going to play this up as a victory, right?
And of course, just to jump in real quick, I mean, Trump is pulling the debate far to the right. He just recently, in that interview with Fox News, reiterated his commitment that we've been warning about, sounding the alarm on this show, about unilateral military action against Mexico, talking about taking out the drug cartels, talking about direct action violating the sovereignty of Mexico, which, you know, we know how the Democrats react to this. As opposed to pushing back against that, they end up conceding that space and shifting to the right. Biden already talked about shutting down the border. We had Kamala Harris with her awful tone coming down here. I mean, we were talking about what to talk about on the show, and one of the things I always want to remind people of is she's the one who said it with that tone, do not come, right? Scolding us as if we were children, right? That's what Latin America knows about Kamala Harris. She's not some kind of savior to us. But anyway, the point is that, I mean, we've seen this debate shifting to the right. They know that they're weak on this, that this is going to be one of the major topics in the election. And so you're right. I totally agree with you. I think that's an important point to make. The U.S. wants to sell this as like the big victory about doing something. Of course, they mentioned fentanyl. Fentanyl is the key issue here, saying that they're involved. This is going to be a major blow to the import of fentanyl by criminal organized groups into the United States, which is killing hundreds of thousands of Americans, et cetera, et cetera.
So that's we have to see it in a campaign optic, right? This clear attempt that's going to come to spin this as a victory, for the Harris campaign, right? What's the other faction that's really going to try to spin this as a victory is the DEA faction that is obsessed with López Obrador. Yeah. The DEA faction that is just obsessed, foaming at the mouth, obsessed with López Obrador, as we've seen by the series of leaks during the campaign, as we've talked about on the show, that came out in ProPublica and Inside Crime and Deutsche Welle and New York Times, and became a huge bot campaign in the campaign. And then just last week, as we talked about on this program, ProPublica came out with another nothing burger to follow their original nothing burger, still trying desperately somehow to connect AMLO and any one of his campaigns to narco, right? So this whole DEA, Tim Golden, Anabel Hernandez faction, right? The DEA and their media spokespeople are, they're going to try to spin this as, to find a way to justify their witch hunt against AMLO, and by extension against Claudia, and use that to try to intimidate the incoming Sheinbaum government so that they don't take further measures against the DEA or against the security state in Mexico beyond the national security law that's already in place. This is very clear. To try to intimidate the incoming government, right?
Absolutely. That's what this is. Yes. Yeah. Yes. It's going to be used as a bludgeon to try to get Mexico to concede a little bit on this DEA. The DEA wants to have free reign like it used to under the PRIAN and the neoliberal regime to do as it can. I threw this up there because it's almost farcical at this point. This is Guacamaya leaks. So here's the thing about Guacamaya leaks. It was a very interesting phenomenon, I think, when it came out, because if you look at that, they're very well versed in that anti-statist, autonomous kind of leftist language. It's extraordinary about how accurate they are. If you ask me to speculate, which I know is dangerous, but I'm going to do it anyway, I think this is a state level, intelligence level kind of operation. The sophistication of it is just a little bit too much to be amateur for me. But it is farcical because it's treated as very serious, right? When it first came out, all of the bourgeois media, all of the mainstream media came out and talked about it as if, this is kind of like anonymous, that whole kind of, intelligence that's done, through these kinds of hacking efforts, et cetera, et cetera. But Guacamaya leaks gained some kind of credibility. But look at this here. I mean, this is a Photoshop picture of El Mayo Zambada with the shirt dyed a different color or photoshopped a different color. And even look here, right? A little fake Morena logo on it. And it's just hilarious. What it says here, this is a blow against López Obrador. Information at the time indicates that Ismael El Mayo Zambada was taken care of by elements of the Mexican army. And he was a beneficiary of the social programs of the Fourth Transformation. Beneficiary of the social programs. El Mayo Zambada, he was really, really depending on that, senior pension that
3,000 pesos a month really kind of tied him over,
Of course, not the millions of dollars that he's able to accumulate as a result of his drug trafficking criminal operations. No, the social, what absurd. And yet this is still treated. But you're right. This is telling. This is what that DEA kind of thinking those actors are actually kind of zeroing in on to try to smear the government and smear Claudia Sheinbaum, and obviously with eye towards trying to get her to change her policy. They're really betting on this. We'll get to this later when it comes to Venezuela as well. I saw the correspondent for Reforma saying, "Oh well, I hope Claudia Sheinbaum also cast doubt on the election result in Venezuela." They keep wanting to insist that they're going to drive a wedge between López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum. They think they can do it here. They're obviously not going to pull it off.
Yeah, and this idea that they're going to use the whole Mayo Zambada thing, to finally get something to back up their desperate accusations against AMLO over the past 6 months. The person who really should be scared is Felipe Calderón.
Oh yeah,
right. If there were any justice in the world, that's the information that Mayo Zambada most likely has information about. That was his period of greatest activity, and we know that the Calderón government was, collaborating with the cartel through their security minister, Genaro Garcia Luna. That's where the real story is. And that's where the real story has been the whole time, that they're trying to get you distracted over here with, look what I'm doing with this hands, right, with the Tim Goldens or whatever else, while the real story has been staring everyone right in the face the whole time, right? Garcia Luna was even, tried and convicted in a U.S. court, in a Brooklyn court. But that got, precious little attention at the time when he was in office, and then even during the trial, because they're all trying to distract you over here with something else, and they're going to try to do that again now with Zambada. Look over here, look over here, look over here. This backs up our non-story.
Yeah.
If anything, Zambada has information that could make Calderón quake in his boots, and what they're just betting on is that the media is not going to play up that information or not going to inform that information. Yeah. Right? They're just going to try to keep the omerta on that part. Right? So we'll see how that plays out. And another point that I think it's very important to make, and we have a video here by Mike Vigil, who is the former head of international operations for the DEA, and has really become a very interesting dissenting voice, within that structure, or formally within that structure. We often have the idea that the DEA or institutions like the DEA are monoliths, and they are all in lockstep, and they all believe the same thing. And actually, no. Within the DEA, there are different currents, and there's one current in there that has this obsession with López Obrador, and there are others, like Mike Vigil, who came out and said, basically, there's nothing there on this. There's nothing there on this. And he said this months ago, right? Now, in this clip, which we're going to play here, because I think it's very important, Vigil makes a very important point about what's known as the kingpin strategy. This media strategy, because it's a media strategy, it's a political strategy. It's not actually an operational strategy that's effective in any way. It's a media PR strategy to take out cartel bigwigs, for big splashy headlines to justify further operations and further budgets and further weaponry and further this and further that and further promotions and all that and advancement for, intelligence security bureaucrats, but really does nothing to change the underlying dynamic of the situation, right? And so here's what Vigil says about the arresting of El Chapo. Let's see what he has to say about this.
Porque hay que ver cuando fue capturado por la última vez Chapo Guzmán y fue extraditado a los Estados Unidos, no tuvo ningún impacto. Entonces, para tener un impacto en una red criminal, tienes que desarticular la red desde arriba hasta abajo.
¿Cómo podemos entender estos últimos arrestos en el marco de la cooperación que ya se ha ido incrementando dentro de la administración actual, tanto del presidente Joe Biden como del presidente López Obrador, que han hecho este diálogo de alto nivel en temas de seguridad, que ha incluido varias visitas tanto de una delegación de Estados Unidos a México como de México hacia Estados Unidos, precisamente para poder tener esta sinergia que deje los arrestos trascendentales para combatir este tema de las drogas y particularmente el fentanilo?
Pues ojalá que la colaboración siga adelante, pero yo creo que todavía está dañada, entonces se va a tener que mejorar porque los únicos que ganan si no tenemos buenas relaciones son los carteles.
En el momento que se...
Okay. So that's the clip, and this is the key point, right? What Vigil said here, and we'll just translate it, kind of paraphrase it. They arrested El Chapo Guzman, the big El Chapo, right? The big leader, who'd been in
Big
prison
fish.
twice in Mexico, the big fish, who'd escaped twice from prison in Mexico, the famous tunnel with the rails and, a big show. Did that arrest change the underlying dynamic of the cartel? No, of course it didn't. And this is the former head of international operations for the DEA saying this, right? What happened after that was then Ann Milgram came out and said, we've been going after El Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo, who are even worse.
Right.
Right? That's what she said. They're even worse. So this is the problem with the kingpin strategy and the whole drug war in general. It's not designed to be effective. It's designed to never end. Because with the kingpin strategy, it will never end. They'll get one kingpin, it will be replaced by other kingpins who will then perhaps be arrested, and then other kingpins will come in who will be seen as being even worse or being even more vicious or being even bloodier, which then requires, even bigger budgets, even more arms, even bigger investment in all this, and it never ends because it's not designed to end. This is designed to be the military arm of U.S. imperialism in Latin America.
Exactly.
So they have to have a justification for it to be a forever war.
Yep.
This is the forever drug war, right? And as you mentioned before the program, Jose Luis, this could probably lead to more violence, right? In the wake of Mayo Zambada being arrested, right? As all the pieces play out, right?
That's the part that worries me the most.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the part that always fails to get mentioned whenever something like this happens is that the fallout will be paid by ordinary Mexicans who will now be subject to a turf war. Right?
That's right.
That's what happens every time they get one of these kingpins. There's a battle, the different factions fight, somebody wants to play to be the leader at the top, and they end up unleashing terrible violence in order to secure control of those plazas, of those routes, as usual, because the guy at the top was taken out and he was the one who held it all together. Obviously, there's never a discussion about the demand side of the problem. They always want to attack the supply side, saying that the problem is the drug traffickers, the problem is Mexico, the problem is the drugs that are flowing across the border, not all the people who are putting these drugs into their bodies. It's not being treated as a public health. I insist on this so much because ultimately, yes, there are many lives being lost in the United States. I feel for them because they're obviously dealing with an addiction and they're not having the supports that they need. But also, the Mexicans on this side have to deal with unsafe communities. They have to deal with extortion rackets. They have to deal with organized crime groups that have been expanding their tentacles and reaching into different parts of society. And it only gets worse every time. The strategy doesn't make sense. And we heard it there too, right? If this is your strategy, it has to go from the top to the bottom. You can't just get rid of it. You can't just cut off the head. It's a hydra. A new one will come up.
And then Lopez Obrador has mentioned also, yeah,
exactly. And of course, unfortunately, the violence will be paid by the Mexican population, and that's the part that I find so frustrating because it never enters into the equation. Right? It's never considered.
Invisible.
They love their photo ops. They don't talk about the ripple effect that this is going to have, and it makes me very, very frustrated because. I mean, it's very predictable. And we heard it as well, too, even from Mike, who, he's free to speak more freely, right, now that he's retired. But same thing. What did he insist on at the end of that interview? We need more collaboration. We need more coordination, right? The only people who win when we don't coordinate. Really? I mean, the DEA has been accused of all kinds of things. There was just a report about them having this WhatsApp group where they talked in vulgar terms about really disgusting behavior that they engaged in because they have free reign in much of the world, which is what they want to have in Mexico again, when they were actually charged. One of them was charged with engaging in sexual assault. This is the way that these actors act, and this is who they want to treat as people who should be taken seriously, who should be given more free reign, who should be taken off their leash. Come on. And not to mention a long history of alleged links between the DEA and actual organized crime groups, of actually being facilitators of drug trafficking throughout the Western Hemisphere.
Absolutely. And when you have a government that does try to attack the causes, so that it doesn't become a never-ending war in this Hydra dynamic, what do you get? You get a wall of sneer from the international media. A wall of sneer saying, hugs not bullets, hugs not bullets, hugs not bullets, right? As if that were a literal strategy instead of a metaphor for talking about addressing the social causes that lead people into, organized crime and drug cartels and addictions, right? That's what you get, a wall of effing sneer from these people. Right?
Or they'll parade out Anabel Hernandez, right, with her unsourced claims, constantly making up whatever kind of statement will get her published in Deutsche Welle and ProPublica or wherever else, right? And I think here it's interesting. We saw the reaction from López Obrador saying, I think Anabel Hernández is a DEA informant. I mean, how does she cultivate these so-called sources, right? I mean, it's not beyond the realm of imagination to think that she's actually intimately tied with organized crime groups and U.S. agencies like the DEA. And López Obrador in the Mañanera from a couple of days ago says they want to weaken his government in order to start to order him from abroad. And he totally rejects having talked to El Mayo or that he received money from narco trafficking, right? That allegation, of course, has surfaced, like you said, that one that came up again in ProPublica that we broke down last week. We invite our watchers and listeners to check out the losers and haters of last week's episode, where we get into the nitty gritty of that, but talking about how there's just nothing to it. It doesn't make any sense. There's no actual proof. It's just allegations. It's just people talking. But here they go, right? Oh, Mayo Zambada was captured. This is bad news for López Obrador. When, like you said, we have to insist on this. The guy who's actually nervous is Felipe Calderón.
Right.
All right. Moving on to our next topic here. Kurt, you can introduce us to this issue here. I'll just give a kind of quick rundown. But we mentioned this. Our least favorite member of Mexico's ruling class, Salinas Pliego, is once again going on the attack and accusing journalists of financial terrorism.
Wow.
Which is, I didn't even know that was a thing.
Yeah.
Because according to Grupo Salinas, according to his conglomerate, there was a coordinated, sophisticated campaign to weaken a bank, his bank, Banco Azteca, to rob it of its solvency. And this is what they equate to financial terrorism. All because Salinas Pliego is a critic of López Obrador and the fourth transformation of Mexico, La 4T. And the allies of the 4T, the fourth transformation, engaged in this terrible financial terrorism to harm it. And of course, we've seen some voices out there talking about how this isn't about Salinas Pliego. This is about a national bank, a bank that serves the poorest of the poor, a bank that steals from the poorest of the poor, that engages in usury rates. Yeah. It has this chain of stores, the Electra stores, that charges exorbitant interest rates for goods that people can pay on a monthly basis, right? This is not, the great poor people's bank. Actually, the poor people's bank in Mexico is El Banco de Bienestar. It's the state-owned bank created by López Obrador. But this is the case. Once again, he claims to be a champion of political causes, of freedom, and yet he is now trying to basically silence the press using the U.S. court system.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about this case. We've talked previously about, Tio Richie, right? And how he's not doing so well these days, right? His businesses aren't doing so well. His TV station isn't doing so well. The bank isn't doing so well. He owes money in the U.S. He lost his golf course in Huatulco, his publicly maintained private golf course that they turned into a nature reserve. So he's gotten very whiny recently, right? He's gone after and harassed journalists online, right? He considers himself to be, a very witty, a person. He's just, kind of this classic vulgarian of the elite, right? So as we see here on the screen, the Salinas group threatened back in January that they were going to take action against independent journalists that had apparently, through their incredible media power, undermined the image of his, great beneficial public service bank, by pointing out that he's in financial difficulties. And he said they contended that people should withdraw their deposits and close their accounts and whatever. It's, this whole, paranoia on the part of Salinas Pliego, right? And so they went ahead last week with this threat, both in Jalisco, in Mexico, and in Los Angeles, right? In which they're trying to unmask anonymous accounts, right? And then accounts that do have names attached to them, extort more information out of them to get that information out there, right? This is very much in line with what we call in the U.S. a slap suit,
right?
which is a strategic lawsuit against public participation, which is not a lawsuit that's really designed to go anywhere. Because there is freedom of speech after all, at least theoretically, at least on paper, at least marginally, right? So, you would think that criticizing a bank would be kind of the quintessence of free speech, right? This suit is designed to intimidate. It's designed to harass. It's designed to, distract people's time and attention and effort and money, right? And to have to defend a suit in 2 different countries.
That's right.
That's what this is about. So it went against YouTubers with significant platforms, right? So we're talking about Vicente Serrano, right, of Sin Censura, right? With, also Luis Guillermo Hernandez, who also appears on Sin Censura, Juncal Solano, right, who has her own platform, and Salinas Pliego has been harassing her basically nonstop for quite a while now. Nacho Rodriguez de Chapucero, right? Álvaro Delgado of Los Periodistas and Sin Embargo, right? So,
I just want to jump in. There was a really good one from Poncho Gutierrez.
Oh, yes.
He was on. He was on Astillero's show, and he's a very witty guy. He's actually quite funny.
He's funny.
Yeah. They say he's the most handsome man of the 4T, by the way. So check him out if you're. Well,
I guess that's not counting us.
Not counting us, of course.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, and he's like, no. I'm not worried at all because I know the champions of free speech, all of those defenders of freedom of expression like Denise Dresser are going to come out and defend me. Yeah. And he was very clear. He's like, listen, there was this campaign. It's true. There was people who were like, hey, take your money out of Banco Azteca because why should you support a guy who's clearly acting against your class interests, which makes sense to me. Yeah. He's like, I actually never joined on to it. I was not part of it. I saw that it was happening. But of course, because he's a big name, because he has an audience, because he's sympathetic to the 4T, he was included in this lawsuit himself. It's a very witty thing. For those of you who understand, speak Spanish, check it out. He's on Astillero's show. Quite funny. Astillero as well had a lot of fun with it. Just thought I'd throw that in there.
Now, a couple of points about this. First of all, and we have to be, honest here and say it as it is. One of the other people who's been mentioned on the list is the Catrina Norteña, which is a suit that's also, anonymous. It doesn't reveal who she is and is under no obligation to do so, right? And this is where there's, there have been voices within Morena who have also jumped on this bandwagon of trying to out anonymous accounts, right? So Morena doesn't have its hands completely clean on this because they've been playing the same game of who are you? Let's try to out anonymous accounts for people who have no obligation to out themselves.
Yeah,
right? You can put whatever name you want on a Twitter account, right?
I mean, there's some of us like us.
Certain voices are involved in this. Not the same thing, but a similar dynamic. Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, I'm saying, just like, there's people like us. We put our name, our first and last names out there. You can Google me and figure out my trajectory. There's not a problem. But there are other people who are not comfortable with that. In fact, there's a young activist in the U.S., Kaya Walsh, who is recently did a Twitter string about how she somewhat regrets being so public and using her name for everything because now she's facing harassment. She's facing criminal harassment, stalking behavior. People publish her home address on the internet, right? Obviously, Musk and his ownership of X doesn't do anything about this anymore, right? Because he's leaned towards the far right and sympathetic of this and has instructed his, underlings to not take any action around this. So it is dangerous for some people. If you're getting out there and you're publishing stuff, there's some people who'd rather stay anonymous and they have a right to. It's fine. This is 2024. It's the age of the internet. There are anonymous accounts out there. And I agree with you that we shouldn't be playing that game either, trying to out people, and Morena shouldn't be doing it either. The people who are comfortable being public, fine. Those who aren't, leave them alone.
Right. That's an important point. And a second point is, if we just kind of take a step back, what does this say about the media landscape in Mexico and the increasing power of YouTubers?
Good point.
This is really something. Salinas Pliego is from the old guard, the old school, the 90s privatization generation, right? He actually famously took out a massive loan from Raul Salinas de Gortari, the brother of Salinas de Gortari, to buy TV Azteca, which then Raul Salinas said he never paid back, which wouldn't surprise me at all, right? So this is how he managed to gobble up what was formerly a public television station, Imevisión, if I'm not mistaken, right? In the whole privatization wave of the 90s, right? With a loan, a personal loan from the brother of the president. How about that?
Yeah.
Right? So
Well,
this was part of the...
He literally stole, we have this tweet up on the screen, he stole a television station.
Yeah, well, this is it. This is the TV Azteca.
It was a news station, and it was called El Chiquihuitazo. El Chiquihuite is a mountain, but part of a mountain range in the north of the city, but it's very tall, and then there's not a lot of interference there. So there's TV antennas and radio antennas up there. In fact, I used to live near that, and you got the best signal possible when you live close to El Chiquihuite. They sent private, heavily armed forces to storm the actual antenna and take it over so that he could occupy the signal, and then keeps it. You turn on TV right now, Canal 40 is owned and run and conducted by Salinas Pliego's group, ADN 40. But it was just taken.
Yeah.
And they argued that they had a right to, and then blah, blah, blah. And then the courts, to go back to the judicial reform, didn't do anything. And he basically was able to consolidate his control over a channel that does not belong to him.
So this is how Salinas Pliego, availed himself of his media empire, right? Loan from the president, loan from the brother of the president, whatever, didn't pay back to get Univision, storming Channel 40 physically, to gobble up public assets and use the public spectrum, the radio television spectrum. Here, it's funny that in this interview with Adela Mecha, she asked him, is there hay línea in TV Azteca? Is there an editorial line in TV Azteca? Because they always play this game that the media department is always totally independent of us. This is where Salinas Pliego is helpful because he says the quiet part out loud. He says, of course there's an editorial line. Of course there's an editorial line. He says the Jornada has an editorial line, and so do we. Right? So this is it. This is somebody who, availed himself, by fraudulent means of a public station, privatized it to use it for his editorial purposes, which we've seen since Paco Stanley assassination onward. 30 years of this.
You might want to remind some of our listeners. They may not have been born when that happened. What's the story
there's a
then?
series. I think it's on
one of right.
There's actually a 6-episode series, and that will tell you everything you need to know about the Paco Stanley assassination and how that was used and manipulated to undercut the first left-wing mayor of Mexico City, which was Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas in the late 90s.
Blaming him exclusively for the so-called security crisis in Mexico City. Right.
So
as really existed at the time.
Yeah. As les dejamos eso de tarea. We'll leave you that for homework.
Let us know if it's any good. I see it pop up on my suggestions, and I'm like, but I remember that scandal.
I think it's a fictionalized account told from different places. Yeah.
Had a bag of Coke fall out of his pocket while he was dancing on television and live. But anyway,
who was one of Paco Stanley's guests back in the day? Mayo Zambada. You see, it all comes around. It all comes around. Anyway, so my point was, that's true. How has the media landscape changed? That the big fraudulent magnate of the old days, of the big media duopoly of TV Azteca, Televisa and TV Azteca, is now so threatened by the new generation of YouTubers that he's taking them to court.
Yeah.
Right. So threatened by Vicente Serrano, Juncal Solano, Luis Guillermo, Chapucero, Avo Delgado, and others, that he's trying to silence them. That's how important social media, communicators and YouTubers have become in Mexico, to the detriment of this huge, creaking, fraudulent landscape of corporate media, chayoteros, and the television duopoly. I mean, how Mexico has changed that he felt the need to try to take legal action to silence these people.
Well, we have this tweet here from Mario Campa on the screen, right? I mean, the consequences are real. Mm-hmm. The actions, the shares of Electra, which is part of Grupo Salinas, which is that store that I tell you that sells stuff to poor people using very high interest rates, dropped 10%. They actually had to freeze. You can see this line here. It's actually that straight line is the actions, the shares being frozen, no longer being eligible for being bought share because it was collapsing, because the price was falling precipitously. And so obviously, like the U.S. stock market, they intervened to keep it from plummeting to zero and basically destroying all of its value. So the consequences of it are real. Like, this is a real thing that's happening to his business interests. That's why he sends his attack dogs on TV Azteca to, for example, Javier Alatorre just the other day, praising the economic policies of Javier Milei. Meanwhile, there are people who are literally starving now in Argentina as a result of Javier Milei's, but that doesn't matter because the stock price went up, right? And he definitely used it. He did it around the textbooks. Right? Remember, he was mad at López Obrador. It happened to be when the textbooks were being published. In Mexico, textbooks are totally free to every student, public and private. They're published, created by the state and published and printed for free and distributed via schools. They're actually really quite nice. It's a really good effort. They were focusing on, of course, the typos here and there, but they went on this whole campaign going way beyond that, saying that it was communism and it was indoctrination, all this kind of stuff, using his attack dogs in the media station that he controls, that has an editorial line to advance his interests because he was mad at the government, right?
Mm-hmm.
But of course, he personally is not doing so well as a result of his actions, his shares of Electra going down. Personally, he lost $1 billion. $1 billion.
Yeah, with that kind of Dr. Evil Pinky, because it's not just a million. He lost $1 billion.
Yeah.
Right. And
sorry, I'm wrong. That's in one day. He lost $3 billion in the year, but in one day, can you imagine $1 billion in a day?
This guy doesn't have $1 billion to lose with the debts he's racked up, and
he's in trouble.
Taxes.
He's in trouble. I mean, that's what his business model was. Loans you don't pay back, taxes you never pay, right?
Mm-hmm.
And unscrupulous behavior to advance your class interest. That was his business model. Well, it doesn't work because there's a government that no longer kisses your feet. That's why he's so mad.
It's all coming crashing down. Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sure we'll come back to Salinas Pliego, some other thing. He'll come back. We should just seize his assets already. That's why I push for the radicalization of the 4T. I mean, who cares, right? Like, there comes a point where these people actually become dangerous to the democratic life of the country. He's already doing it. I think there are plenty of signs. Let's just seize his stuff. Who cares? We'll compensate you. We got the money. We recovered Pemex. We'll pay you off, and then you can go to your resort somewhere in Miami. I don't care.
Yeah.
All right. Speaking of political transformations in Latin America and radicalization, we have good news coming out of Venezuela. So I've mentioned previously, we don't talk too much about other countries here. We keep the focus on Mexico, but I have been covering Venezuela since 2005. So I've been at this for almost 20 years. A very close follower of the Bolivarian Revolution. I live and work as a journalist covering Venezuela for Venezuela Analysis. And we had a very long day yesterday. More so my colleagues who are based in Venezuela, they were in Caracas. They started very, very early in Venezuela. When there's an election, they toca de Diana at 3 or 4 in the morning. And that's when everybody starts to get moving and going, and ended up going up to a very late night covering the results. But of course, we can see here the headline: Maduro wins. He won. It was largely billed as an election that was finally the opportunity for the opposition to win, to unseat that dictator in Venezuela. Of course, curious dictatorship that runs elections, right? That can be ousted via a vote. But in Venezuela, we saw Nicolás Maduro being proclaimed the winner with the data from the National Electoral Council, with 51.2% of the vote compared to 44.2% for his rival, Edmundo González. So just to put things in a little bit in context here, so why was this in mainstream media sold as the opportunity to unseat Maduro, to end the Bolivarian Revolution, to see a change in government? Well, the opposition is a far-right, anti-democratic actor. There are many oppositions, but the main one here, the one that as represented by Edmundo González, is filled with fascists, people who have engaged in insurrectionary strategies, in violent street protest, who claim that this unknown lawmaker who raised his hand in the middle of a plaza in Caracas, the capital, was somehow the interim president, who coordinated with the worst of the worst, Elliot Abrams, in the White House, with the Boltons, with Trump, These are the kinds of people that are working, and they often boycotted elections, knowing full well that they had no realistic chance of winning, pretending as if there was no chance of there having a free and fair election, and therefore they would boycott, et cetera, et cetera. It's too much history to get into, but suffice it to say, it was a very intransigent, uncooperative, far-right opposition that finally said, you know what, we're fine, we'll run a candidate this time around. They wanted to run Maria Corina Machado, who was, by virtue of an agreement made with the opposition, disqualified by the Supreme Court and not allowed to run. The opposition agreed. That never makes it to the articles that talk about Venezuela. The opposition agreed to these rules. These rules said that Maria Corina Machado could not run. She was not allowed to run. So they had a stand-in candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, and they were just convinced. And there's a lot of parallels to Mexico here. They had big rallies. Won't say that they didn't. They are able to mobilize a segment of the population. There's definitely 44.2% at least that sympathizes with them. But they were convinced that because they had big rallies, because the mainstream media was blowing smoke up their asses, that they were going to win. And they didn't. They didn't have a good machine. They didn't have a good campaign. They basically ran on nothing. They promised nothing. The only people who were talking about policy was the pro-government bloc. And then there was a document that was leaked that actually said what they intended to do, which, surprise, surprise, privatize everything. And they lost. They lost the election. They lost 51.2%. And obviously now we're seeing a lot of voices out there claiming that it was a fraud and that as a result, the result can't be recognized. I wanted to bring something up here, which I think is quite hilarious because it just shows to the bankruptcy of some of their ideas. So we have Ryan Berg, political scientist, director at CSIS Americas. I always find it funny when people put their credentials in their Twitter handles. Oh, I have a PhD. I'm Dr. Berg. But anyway, not a very bright guy, but thinks he's a lot smarter than he is. Puts out this tweet. The Nicolás Maduro regime cannot count to 100. Apparently, 109% of the votes have been counted, with the loyal oppositions getting 4.6% each. Tell me you've engaged with mega fraud without telling me you engaged in mega fraud. Source to the source. So here's the thing. I, unlike Berg, unlike all the people who are sharing this stupid graphic, actually watched the presentation. And if you watch Elvis Amoroso give the results, there's no doubt what he's saying is that Nicolás Maduro got 51.2, Edmundo Gonzalez got 44.2, and the rest of the 8 other candidates, again, what a curious dictatorship that has 10 presidential candidates on the ballot, got 4.6% together. Now, Telesur made a sloppy graphic and gave them 4.6% each, but this is not from the CNE. This is not from Elvis Amoroso. Right. This is from Telesur, who made a sloppy graphic, but of course they ran with it, right? These people are dishonest and they're not particularly bright. They don't even do the work of like, well, what was actually said? Isn't that kind of weird? Why would it add up to 100? And of course, they make their little snide comments, right? But it was obvious. And people have been running with this stupid graphic just because Telesur made it. But they're like, oh, but it's the state-sponsored media. So what? It's an independent operation. I worked at Telesur. I know how the show works. Somebody in the graphics department made this graphic and they put it up on the screen. But they've been running with it because they think that makes their case. Oh, it's a mega fraud. I've observed elections in Venezuela. I've observed elections in other places. It's actually one of the most secure election systems in the world. It has all kinds of safeguards. Just to give you a quick rundown of how it works. You walk into the polling location, you present your voter ID card. The voter ID card is scanned. You have to put your fingerprint and it's contrasted to the database. That gives you authorization to go in a machine to plug in your vote to who you're actually going to vote, which is actually the name, the party, and a picture for those who are perhaps illiterate of who you want to vote for. It gets tabulated by the machine, which is not connected to the internet until the end of the day. And then it prints a little receipt, and that little receipt gets put in a box. And then 51% of the voting boxes are audited randomly, right? To contrast, does the machine count match the paper count? So it's almost impossible to actually engage in ballot box stuffing, the kinds of typical mechanisms used to engage in fraud. And of course, there is a whole process that provides for transparency where obviously, it was a very long night. Those results haven't been published, but they will be published. If there was fraud, it'll be perfectly obvious that there was manipulation. But if there isn't, all of these voices, what are they going to be left with, right? But no, they think that because Telesur published a graphic that shows 4.6%, that adds up to more than 100%. That's proof of the mega fraud. They don't even know how Venezuela's electoral system works and all the safeguards it has in place. And there's been some voices out there who are saying, well, the only international observers were the ones that were friendly. Is the Carter Institute friendly? Are they there to parrot the dictatorship's position? Of course not. No, this is what we had. And to bring the Mexico connection in, we had a reaction from López Obrador. Generally, that's what we've seen from a lot of countries, congratulating Venezuela on participating, and that there wasn't violence. There was the threat of violence by the opposition. Leading up to the election, Maduro gave a speech saying that if we don't win by a large margin, the far right is going to unleash violence onto the streets. There are going to be rivers of blood in the streets or something to the effect, which is true because that's exactly what the opposition has done. Did it in 2013, it did it in 2014 and 2017. Violent street protests. They literally would hang wire across roads where they decapitated people on motorcycles. This is what the opposition represents. People forget that. They act like they're this pro-democracy force trying to restore democracy in Venezuela. And so there wasn't any of that, although there's worry that there could be some violence in the coming days. But obviously, López Obrador has always been consistent on this. I want to see the final result. The result that we just shared with you is based on 80% of the actas, the tallies being counted. And he actually, of course, also criticized the mainstream media, which tried to suggest that Nicolás Maduro was the one promising violence. And so, anyway, just to sum up on that point, and I'll switch it over to you to talk about the Mexico connection as well. It's also really frustrating that the people who have cried fraud in every single election that they have lost, the U.S.-backed opposition in Venezuela, should be believed in this case. The boy who cried wolf every single time, this time it's real. This time there was actually fraud. Really, we're going to believe Maria Corina Machado, who I'll remind you became famous because she met with George W. Bush in the White House. That's how long she's been conspiring against the Bolivarian Revolution with U.S. imperialism. And now suddenly she's the savior of Venezuelan democracy. Please, these people are pathetic. You know nothing about Venezuela. You think you're suddenly experts on this. You don't even know how the vote system works. You think Telesur's graphic is somehow proof of a mega fraud. Gosh.
Yeah, and the Mexico connection, as you said, is quite clear because the right wing in Mexico, it's the same game. You would think that the base, just a baseline for any political party operating in Venezuela or in Mexico would be to defend popular sovereignty, just as a baseline. Any party, right? We disagree on this, and this, but we will never tolerate, we'll never put up with, international intervention in our affairs. Right? Just a baseline. And actually, the right wing would actually have much more popular legitimacy if they just did that minimal thing. Right? But what we see is an absolute entreguista right wing in Venezuela, comically and grotesquely so in the case of Maria Corina Machado, who's famously called for U.S. intervention in a proper country, and even for U.S.
intervention
to bomb her own country like they did in Syria. I mean, bomb my country, please. That we're not making this up. Right? But the Mexican opposition is not that far behind that.
Yeah.
Right? When they go running off to the OEA, when they go running off to the White House, when they go running off to the Wilson Center, when they go running off to the King of Spain, right? They won't openly say invade, but they'll say it in very, thinly coded speech. They won't say bomb us, please, like Corina Machado, but they'll all but say it. And it's very clear to the Mexican public how much of a sellout they are. Right? So this has undermined Latin American democracy forever. The fact that right-wing parties up and down Latin America, especially Venezuela and Mexico, but not only, routinely sell out their own country to the empire. So it just undermines attempts to create national democracy, local democracy, regional democracy, because they refuse to adhere to a simple baseline of we disagree on everything, but no foreign intervention. That's been the biggest lastre. That's been the biggest drag on Latin America forever. Traitorous right-wing parties, and we see it again and again and again. And so it's funny that who wanted to show up and participate in that whole, traitorous gangbang was Vicente Fox, right?
As well.
And trying to take off from Panama, not invited, right, to make this a stupid media event. And they didn't let him in. Why should they let him in?
Why should they? Why should they
let Vicente Fox in to make this a media event? Right?
He was not invited. You have to be invited. There's rules. They think that they're above the rules. This is extraordinary. They think you can just buy a plane ticket, flying first class into Panama, and then hop onto the next flight over to Caracas. On what? A tourist visa? And then you should just be received with open arms with your plots cooperating with U.S. imperialism and the far right in Venezuela? Why should they? Marco Cortés, in his case, actually made it in. But then they figured out who he was and what he was doing. Here's a picture with him, with Enrique Capriles Rodonsky, another member of the Venezuelan opposition. And he was kicked out. Rightfully so. Rightfully so. Good thing you were deported. You had no business being there. You got in there under dubious circumstances, and I'm glad that they caught you. They didn't rough you up. They didn't do anything to you. They told you, hey, you're not allowed in the country. You're doing something that's not allowed. You should have asked to become an observer. Maybe we would have let you in, but you didn't, so you got to go. End of story, right? But of course, the dictatorship kicked me out. Oh, woe is me, right? I really liked your point about how this has been dragging Latin America down in general for centuries.
For centuries.
Literally, the ruling class in Latin America, instead of pursuing the national interest, right? I know this is a debate in Marxist circles, right? Is there or not a progressive national bourgeoisie? The bourgeoisie in Latin America has always been tied to transnational trade and transnational capital, and has always played to the interests of transnational capital over the national interest. That's who these parties represent. The PAN represents the interests of transnational capital. That's why they're so interested in destroying the Bolivarian Revolution and going down there and doing their show. And I'm worried that the right here in Mexico, because they were likely to continue to lose elections like they do lose in Venezuela, will go down the same insurrectionary, far-right, violent, interventionist path. Stay democratic. You owe it to your country. And if not, let's seize your shit.
And, I think from the U.S. perspective, where the Republicans and the Democrats have no, class affiliation, no class tie whatsoever. There are millions of Americans who have class identification, but that's not represented in the parties, right? I think they find it very difficult to understand how, the PSUV can continue to win elections.
Yeah.
Right? In the face of withering sanctions and in the face of, I posted a clip by Jeffrey Sachs on my Twitter account today, and he went through piece by piece everything they've done since 2017. It's just brutal. Brutal. I'm not going to repeat it now. Watch the clip by Sachs. But, this idea of we're just going to, cow them into submission. We're going to poverty them into submission. We're going to make them so desperate, right? Like Kissinger in Chile back in the 70s, we're going to make the economy scream. Well, they did. They made the economy scream. They made hyperinflation scream, right? And, the whiz kids at the State Department thought that would be enough to terrorize a population, economic terrorism, that was going to be enough, right? Because that's what they do in the United States. And if you don't have, a class identification, it works. It works. Yep. It works. People get economically terrorized. They take it out in the government that's in power. It's almost axiomatic. But it doesn't work in this situation, and they don't understand it. They don't get it. So that's why the only logical explanation they can think of is that it has to be fraud. So that's why you have Blinken coming out last night. The playbook of the U.S. was very clear. If, Machado's stand-in were to have won, the election is fine. If Maduro was going to win, well, then it was going to be fraudulent, right? So you can't have it both ways. You can't just call fraud when your candidate doesn't win. But that's what they always do.
Yep.
That's what they always do. And they had the same help of the U.S. media that we've criticized so much in this program with relation to Mexico. So you see the Washington Post, just as polls close, put up this splashy headline about an exit poll supposedly showing the right wing 30 points ahead or some ridiculous amount ahead. And they left that there for hours, creating the perception of fraud because there was, a bit of a delay in putting out the results. Right?
Here's
you
the
have
thing.
the New York Times saying that it was riddled with irregularities. The polling was riddled with irregularities.
My friends were down there. People I know personally were down there supervising the vote. There's plenty of witnesses to alleged irregularities. There's odd things that happen in every election everywhere in the world, but that does not constitute fraud. right? But they put that out there, riddled with irregularities. The thing about the exit polls are not legal in Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
The electoral authority does not grant that. Here in Mexico, you go to the INE, and the INE says, okay, you're allowed to do an exit poll, and you can go and interview them. So how did they conduct it? I mean, according to this, they did over 100 polling locations. Did they do it secretly? What polling locations did they go to? Were they representative, right? Were people confident talking to them, knowing full well that exit polls are illegal and they could be committing a crime by participating in that? I mean, it's just absolutely extraordinary. This coming from, Anthony Blinken here. The international community is watching this very closely and will respond accordingly. Oh, now you care about the international community. The international community that just, announced that the occupation of Palestinian territory by Israel is illegal, the one that you ignored, right? Mm-hmm. That international community, the ICC that's seeking to arrest your ally, Netanyahu. Now you care about the international community? Get out of here. You're fucking frauds. Mm-hmm. Anyway, you mentioned the sanctions, and I put it up on the screen there for a second there. We've done tons of coverage around sanctions, but we also published a book. It's called The War Without Bombs over at Venezuela Analysis. It's free. It's available as a PDF online. You can see it here. That's the cover. We had a really nice job here. Putting together all of the facts, the figures, infographics, original articles, analysis about the social, political, and economic impact of sanctions against Venezuela, venezuelaanalysis.com. You can find it there, A War Without Bombs. If you just Google that as well, it comes up if you're interested in that, because it's been brutal. And unfortunately, if the right here in Mexico goes down this path, it's likely that U.S. imperialism will also follow and try to impose the same thing, which would just unleash untold suffering onto the Mexican population, right? All because we dared to elect a government that is counter-hegemonic, that does not subscribe to the Washington consensus. It's what happened in Venezuela and what they may try to do here in Mexico. All right. We're almost at the end here. We're over an hour, but we do want to go to everybody's favorite segment. Before I get into the article, just hilarious.
We need the graphic. We need the graphic. We'll get there. Yeah.
Who praises this? Oh, it's our friend Enrique Krause. Yeah. Gabriel Zaid explains with objectivity and lucidity the June, the June 2nd vote in Mexico. Why did they vote this way? Gabriel Zaid, why did they vote like this?
Why?
Well, let's go through his arguments, right? He says,
he lays it out in a very just, chef's kiss decalogue here. So yeah, let's do this. This one's fun.
So he talks about the election polls, where basically makes the argument that people who are well known are well evaluated, and because there are a lot of 4T politicians who are well known, López Obrador is constantly in the media. That's why people favorably looked upon Claudia Sheinbaum, who obviously we know ultimately won the elections because she was campaigning 3 years before the election, and it gave her great advantage over Xochitl Gálvez, who was unknown up to a year ago. She was well known. She was well known for her theatrics. Let's not forget that she paraded around the Senate, the upper house of Congress, in a dinosaur uniform. She chained herself to a chair. Oh, people know who Xochitl Gálvez was. And that's why, part of the reason that they won.
Yeah. So name recognition, right? They only won because of name recognition. What undermines that argument immediately is that, as we've documented, the more people got to know Xochitl Gálvez, the less they liked her. She was actually better off when she wasn't known. So that one doesn't work. Next.
All right. So and then he talks about how some of the polls said that it was actually a really close race and it was almost a tie. We've talked about those polls. They were badly done polls. They were the massive collar polls. They were the outliers. And so the unexpected victory of 32% was even greater than the one in the polls. It's surprising given that it must mean that millions of voters changed their opinion at the last minute, and that many of those who were polled actually hid their preference for the Morena candidate, maybe because they were embarrassed to tell the interviewer the truth.
Oh, yes. People were so ashamed to vote for Morena, right? That's why people were out in the streets. That's why there was all of this, marches and, these demonstrations of allegiance and such, right? Yes, people were hiding their allegiance to Morena, please, right? The shy Tory phenomenon. Yes, of course. Right.
And the race was actually really close. No, not the dozens of polls that gave her a 20-point lead, 25-point lead.
Yeah.
It was actually only the 2 or 3 that were paid by Xochitl's campaign that were actually representative. So it was a surprise result.
Close was only 20 points instead of 32. That was what close was.
And then, of course, the populism of López Obrador, the paternalism of the social programs. I'm going to give you the same thing that Morena's give you. And they thought, well, I better vote for this to keep my social programs.
Yes. So there we go again. They were bought off.
Yeah, of course. You know. But then why did the PAN run on a pro-social program campaign?
Yeah.
And then only to change their mind after the election and admitting, oh, no, we actually were against them the whole time.
Right. They should have said they were against social programs right there.
Turns out people do want to vote for the government that actually attends to their needs and not the one that promises and then doesn't deliver. All right, moving on to, this is a good one. The narcos intervened in the vote, and surely it was against Xochitl, who was brave and announced that she was going to go against organized crime groups. That's right, the candidate of the PAN, the Garcia Luna's party, was going to go against organized crime groups, so they must have acted against her interest in the election.
Yes, of course. The same Xochitl Gálvez who served in the Felipe Calderón's government that was in hoc with the Sinaloa cartel and never said a word about it.
And then according to Mexico Evalúa, which is funded by USAID, by the way, 50 municipalities with the greatest homicides by gun violence. In 33, the same party won in 2024 that had won in 2021. And so I guess that means that people kept voting for Morena in those. I don't really even understand what.
I don't really understand the point there either.
I guess he's trying to argue that the lack of safety was not important in the vote than the social programs. I guess that's the second graph there. What's the point there? I'm not even sure what the argument is.
They voted for Morena again, so that means that it was the narco.
Yeah, or that they didn't care about safety, I guess. Or maybe they just didn't believe that the PAN was going to do anything about security because they're the ones who brought this problem on us in the first place. With Felipe Calderón's failed war against the cartels. All right.
Pretty thin, Dr. Zaid. Pretty thin. Let's keep going.
Something about abuses against candidates. I mean, I feel like it gets weaker as it goes on. I mean, it started bad and it's going worse.
Yeah.
Something about López Obrador intervened in the electoral system. All right. And they forgave him for intervening in the electoral process, apparently.
Right. As they've, they've been trying to make that case over the last several weeks, right? To make their case before the electoral tribunal, right?
Yeah.
Xochitl should have showed up to make her case before the tribunal instead of bailing out.
Yeah. I mean, if you really believe that was
made this case in person.
Should have pushed for it, right? This one's particularly bad. Holy cow. This really does get worse as you go on. There are some who believe that the vote is not secret and that somehow the government was going to know who voted for them and against them. And so I guess that means that they voted for Morena out of fear. What is it? He's literally pulling this shit out of his ass.
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
So first they were ashamed to vote Morena, and then they were scared of being found out?
Apparently. Yep.
Yeah. Keep going, because it really gets better. Wait till I get to number 10. Just wait for it.
Not all people vote for the government in the country to change or to keep its democratic path. There are some who vote just to vote with the winners. They feel like winners if they vote for the party that won, and losers if they vote for the party that lost, even if it was a better choice. Oh, okay.
People want to identify with the winner. All right.
Sure. And they're too dumb to vote for their interest. They're too dumb to know to vote for the party that actually delivered what it promised. Okay.
So how does that explain 2018 when they hadn't won yet? When they had the same degree of landslide?
Right. Doesn't make sense.
Okay.
Or maybe, I know, they must have been able to see the future and know that Morena was going to win. And that's why, because they wanted to be with the winning team. That must be it.
That's pretty cool.
Political party leaders don't lose even when their party loses. They act as if the candidate was the only one responsible for winning or losing. And they can stay there with the hope that in the next election, they will do better with a better candidate. That one he's actually maybe right. I mean, Marco Cortés was at the top of the party list. His election was always secured. He didn't really even care. And in fact, they used money that was meant for Xochitl's campaign to run ads for themselves, despite the fact that they were at the top of the party list and were virtually assured a seat.
Yeah, throwing Xochitl on the bus there. And of course, you've got Alito running for re-election as president of the PRI and probably going to win there as well. So, okay, we'll give you that one.
All right. Okay, number 10. This is when you said
this is like, the top 10 list, but this is like the...
Oh, boy. Whew, I just read it. Okay.
Yeah.
Universal votes forces millions to vote who do not have a special interest in doing it. They see politics as something remote, something that they don't even understand, that they give little value to their vote. And they don't have the inconvenience of abstaining from voting or voting for the candidate that is most visible or more generous with its gift. They think that the politicians are all the same. And so they resign themselves to accept, well, with these, we got to stick with them.
How dare you let the masses vote? The ignorant masses who don't know enough and don't care enough. How dare you let the masses vote? You could only let men with property vote. Not the masses, says Gabriel Zaid.
And Enrique Krause.
Enrique Krause, of course.
Objectivity, lucidity.
This is what these people think. This is what these people think.
And yet he's treated seriously by mainstream media, English language. He's always given his columns. He's always allowed to pontificate his bullshit. How dare you? It's so insulting. I can't believe this guy is treated as a serious political commentator. This is a farce. It's like the Guacamaya thing that photoshops Morena's logo onto El Mayo Zambada.
Yeah.
This is not serious. Come on. You're not interested. It's just propaganda.
The masses. Not going to let them anywhere near a voting booth again with their ignorance. Their ignorance is going to mess up my dinner jackets.
You're giving me the vapors. That was fun.
Yeah.
Oh, you were right. That was it started terrible and it ended.
Yeah, the end is the real.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, I like that segment too. We always have a lot of fun with it. This is an intense show. We got a lot of topics in there, some hard-hitting stuff. I got pretty worked up with the Venezuela stuff. I care a lot about Venezuela. I wouldn't be the person I am today if it hadn't been for the Bolivarian Revolution, the participation of the masses, the inspiration. I didn't even get the chance to talk about the communards and this incredible exercise in developing a different kind of political organization of the state, of actually not a fourth power, but actually the power of a participatory democracy. Protagonist democracy. There's a lot of interesting things that are happening in Venezuela. There's a lot of negative things as well. I think there's been too many concessions to private capital in Venezuela as a means of surviving. It's understandable. They are under siege. They are being literally subject to a war without bombs that is costing lives. They're not allowed to import medicine. But anyway, I get worked up about it because I care. Because I'm an internationalist, because I'm a proletarian internationalist, and I think that we have a duty to defend the sovereignty of all countries, not just Mexico. It's not just Soberanía in Mexico, it's Soberanía in Venezuela, it's Soberanía in Bolivia, in Nicaragua, Cuba, all of the countries that are facing the imperialist onslaught. So anyway, it's been really good going through this program. Ran a little bit long today, but I hope it's not too bad. I appreciate the patience of our viewers and listeners. And as always, if you like the program, like and subscribe, leave us a comment, share it with your friends. It really helps us out, gets the information out there, especially those of you in the United States who have family members or relatives, friends, co-workers who are interested in Mexico or maybe are uninformed. Don't let them do to Mexico what they've done to Venezuela and letting people drive this narrative about a so-called dictatorship happening there, undermining the democratic expression of the population. Kurt, any last words?
No, my name is Kurt Hackbarth. Here with José Luis Granados Ceja, and we'll see you again for another episode of Soberanía.